Welcome to the Red Sneaker Podcast, your guide to success in the worlds of writing and publishing. Now, here's your host, best-selling author and founder of the Red Sneaker Writers Center, William Bernhardt.
Hello, Red Sneaker Writers. This is episode 17, going out on April 22nd, 2019. This podcast is for Red Sneaker Writers, people who are serious about having a writing career and want practical knowledge to help them do it. My interview on this episode is with one of the largest luminaries in the whole book and publishing world, Jane Friedman. She is an expert in, among other things, business strategy for authors, co-founder of The Hot Sheet, an industry newsletter, and she's got a new book out called The Business of Being a Writer. I'll talk to her about that, but first, the news. If there is a continuing theme to today's news roundup, it is simply that there are so many wonderful opportunities out there for writers, probably more than there's ever been in human history. So there is simply no excuse for the Red Sneaker writer not to force themselves to sit down and get cooking. First, from Tor, Tom Doherty Associates, which is the company that includes Tor and Forge and Tortine and Starscape and I think some others as well, they've announced that they're launching a new horror imprint called Nightfire. First titles will be out in 2021. And this is interesting because horror is one of those genres that from time to time I hear people say, oh, that's dead. Dying, gone, nobody's interested anymore. But here's this whole new imprint from Tor, a company in a position to know that's going to feature dark fantasy and supernatural, new books, reprints of lost classics. Obviously, they don't think horror is dead. In fact, their publisher, Fritz Foy, commented, quote, "There is a renaissance in progress for all things horror. There is a new generation of horror film fans who are setting weekly genre box office records. More importantly, there are new literary voices we want to bring to our reading communities and followers. And also, because we just plain love horror." What could be better than that? Similarly, over at Scribd, that's Scribd, they've announced a new program that's going to offer to their subscribers new works by a range of authors in a new form. They're calling it Scribd Originals, and the idea is that this will involve work that falls between traditional guidelines, longer than an article or short story, but shorter than a novel or a book. Their first title, for instance, is going to be called Muller's War by a journalist, Garrett Graff, and that's going to be available sometime later this year. They're saying basically 50,000 words or less, something for writers to write, or I would assume readers to read, in between other longer work. It's a great idea, really, because I know there are a lot of people, same people who are listening to podcasts like this one, who are interested in some of these subjects, but maybe don't have time right at this moment for a full-length work, but could be very much interested in something shorter. And over at WattPad, which you've heard me mention once or twice before, there were at least two major announcements since the last podcast. First, something called the Blue Bliss imprint, which is being created in Manila in conjunction with Anvil Publishing. And the idea here is to create new media projects based upon the many, many stories at WattPad. But since then, an even bigger story has broken that involves Sony Pictures Television. They are partnering with WattPad to come up with some original programming based on WattPad stories, novels, whatnot, that people have uploaded for free, and many others are reading for free. But the authors, of course, are using this platform to find an audience. To date, more than 500 million stories have been uploaded. And you might wonder, well, how can you possibly find an audience when there's so much stuff out there? And yet some people have. You might wonder, why is this happening now? Why is Sony Pictures, one of the big 5 movie studios in Hollywood, interested in these silly WattPad stories that haven't even appeared in bookstores? Mostly. And the answer, of course, is because they've proven to be wildly successful and popular. Maybe it's got something to do with the success of a new film, which is based on a successful book, which started as a WattPad story, which is called After. Just in case you've been living in a cave somewhere for the last few weeks, After is a romantic film directed and written by Jenny Gage, but based upon a novel by an author named Anna Todd, a young author who was originally fan fiction, which she posted for free on WattPad. It's fan fiction based upon the group One Direction, kind of I don't want to say anything anyone will take offense to. I know a couple of my girls love One Direction, or did till they moved on to the next thing, but kind of a boy band, a pop group. Anyway, Anna Todd posted just after the first few chapters, she got a response. First few chapters of a novel titled After, which was based on 2 guys from the One Direction band, Harry Styles and Zayn Malik, but in this book, they became students at Washington State University. And the story follows, of course, the female protagonist. Her name is Tessa Young, and she is the oh-so-innocent good girl who nonetheless somehow gets wrapped up in a love affair with the bad boy based on Styles. Readers took to this immediately. Fans were demanding more chapters literally faster than Todd could write them within 1 month. 1 month. She, and the first novel in what became a 4-book series, After, was the most talked about work of fiction online, with over 5 million readers on WattPad. Probably no big surprise that Anna Todd was able to land a publishing deal with Simon & Schuster, who got the book into bookstores, and now it's available in the movies. What's the takeaway, Red Sneaker writers? Well, I hope it's obvious. We live in a big, wide world of publishing and books today, which is much wider, much broader, more diverse, and different from what it has been in the past, though I have nothing against traditional publishing, corporate publishing, whatever you want to call it, which goodness knows has been very kind to me, but today that is only one of many routes to finding your audience. And the savvy Red Sneaker writer will be considering all of this, and this is a theme that I'm going to continue in the next section on writing tips. I got an email in response to the last podcast asking why, in my writings tips section, I've never discussed poetry. Do I have something against poetry? Well, no, I definitely do not have a problem with poetry. I've published 2 books of poetry. I've gotten some of the best reviews of my career from poetry. But you know what the cliche is. Poetry's fun to write, and sometimes people enjoy it, but you can't sell it. You can't make any money on it. That's what people have said in the past. But in today's world, that's just not the case, because as I said in the previous section, the world is very much changing. Much of this is driven by a poet named Rupi Kaur, Kaur, who is probably the best known now of all of these so-called Insta-poets. Insta-poets, not because they write their poetry instantly or because you add water and stir, but because they've been publishing their poetry on Instagram, which, again, if you've been living in a cave, that's a social media platform, which ironically requires some kind of visual element. Despite that, it's become a home for poetry and poetry lovers, and many poets like Rupi Kaur, who built her following there to such an extent that she is now the best-selling poet in the United States. She had the best-selling book of 2017, her second poetry collection, The Sun and Her Flowers. She alone helped double poetry sales in 2017. 12 of the top 20 best-selling poetry authors that year were Instapoets. Ms. Carr and others following in her footsteps, finding a way to use photographs or drawings in her case and merging them with poetry to create something that can be shared online. A company called Andrews McMeel is her publisher, and to date they are by far the leading publisher of Instapoets. Now, Andrews McMeel is based in Kansas City, not New York. They're a company, but they're and a big one, but they're not a New York publisher. Nonetheless, because of this devotion to Instapoetry, they now account for 40% of the U.S. poetry market. Most Instapoets begin self-publishing, first on this social media platform, and then in many cases publishing their own ebooks or chapbooks, whatnot. I believe Ms. Carr first published her first book herself, and then once it had racked up a significant amount of sales, it was picked up by Andrews McMeel. Now get this, poetry is now the best-selling category for Ingram Spark. Ingram Spark is, of course, Ingram's distribution service for indie authors. And Ingram, of course, is the world's largest, not the United States, but the world's largest wholesale book distributor. This is a significant bit of business. This growth spurt for poetry began maybe 4 to 5 years ago, and just like the surge in the popularity of audiobooks, it shows no sign of abating. It's not just her. It's affected other poets as well. How surprised was I? Back in 2017, when The Sun and Her Flowers was taking off, I started to see poetry books in the airport when I was traveling and think, what? Have I slipped into a parallel universe or something? And now, not too long ago, I saw a poetry book at Target. How can this be happening? Well, it is happening. This is a Haitian-American author named Pierre Janty, and he broke out with his collection of poetry, which is called Her. It's essentially, although written by a man, a tribute to women. Now you could say, okay, good timing, perfect book, perfect time, Me Too movement and all that. But, there's a certain amount of good timing in every success story. The fact remains, it's good poetry that found its audience online to such an extent that Target contacted Ingram and Ingram Spark asking them to distribute this book, and that's why you can now find it in Target. Bottom line here, getting to the writing tips part, we've got a new generation of poets who have found a new way to present poetry, to combine or merge both art, visual art, and poetic art, and a platform to get in front of people so they can meaningfully engage their audience that want to read poetry and are willing to pay for poetry books. Again, this just continues the whole theme of this podcast. How do you succeed, Red Sneaker writers? By thinking broadly, not being locked into old ideas or old wavelengths or way of thinking, but realizing that today's digital publishing community is diverse, and you can go old school if you want, but the fact remains there are many paths to publishing. How do you succeed? 1, most important, you write something wonderful, and then 2, you find out which one of these many paths is going to be best for your work, your kind of story, novel, poetry, whatever it is, and what's going to be best for you. And that's how you get your work in front of your audience. For this podcast episode, I had the great privilege of talking to Jane Friedman. Jane has at least 20 years of experience in the publishing industry and all kinds of expertise, and she has just come out with a new book called The Business of Being a Writer, which Publishers Weekly says is, quote, destined to become a staple reference book for writers and those interested in publishing careers, end quote. So I asked her about the book. Here's what she had to say. Jane, thanks for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you for